The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
I feel bad for the Minister of Housing. It's a tough portfolio with incredible expectations all over the map. But let's face it, Vancouver is like virtually every other big city in the Western world. It's seeing a huge influx of investment. It's seeing rising housing costs. I'm not sure what this government or any government can do to hold back that tide.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and here we are at about the midpoint of the spring legislature session, and we have a cabinet minister on, and she's got so many titles I'm not sure we can fit them all onto the screen. Selina Robinson, welcome to the show. Thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me, Vaughn.
I have to say, when they announced last summer, the Premier announced that you were going to be in charge of municipal affairs and housing and transit, I thought, this is not fair. He's overloaded you. Did you find it daunting when he asked you to do it?
Well, it's certainly a privilege to serve in John Horgan's cabinet, and I wasn't surprised about him putting those three pieces together.
So how did they fit together?
So I've always been a strong advocate for local government. I come from local government, and I had the critic portfolio the entire time I was in opposition from 2013 to 2017. And when you think about who makes the land use decisions, and you think about how our housing crisis situates itself with the land use decisions, it's really important to be working with local governments to help address this housing crisis that we're facing. And the other layer, the TransLink layer that you identified, when you think about how transit fits into how we live our lives and how transportation fits into how we live our lives, and the opportunities for affordable housing around transit lines, and how local governments fit in with making those transit decisions, it all makes really good sense to have the three files all together.
Now, much of the legislature session has been taken up with questions in the House about some of the tax measures which involve property and housing. And we've been told that some of the details are not ready yet, that we won't get the legislation, speculation tax, for instance. We'll get an outline later this spring. We'll get bills in the fall. Are you getting a lot of questions you can't answer still on the housing file and taxes and those sort of things?
Well, what I'm hearing from people is that they're looking for a way to actually access housing. So what I'm hearing from people is that they're looking for housing that they can afford. And they are hopeful that our tax measures will help address some of the challenges, some of the demand side challenges, but they're also wanting supply that works for them, where they can find a house that they can rent or an apartment that they can rent that meets their family's needs. I've certainly heard from people, one couple that I can think of, where they're living in a basement suite, in a one-bedroom basement suite with their young child, and they're really frustrated because it's hard on their marriage, it's hard on their family, there's really no space, but yet they can't afford anything else, and it's not what they envisioned for their family. So I'm hearing from people who are really just looking for relief from this housing crisis.
Still having complaints from people that it's been a very slow start? I know I've heard that from the Greens, that they think the government hasn't really gotten going on this yet. Well,
we've certainly taken action right out of the gate in September with our commitment to address some of the homelessness issues, our modular housing, the $291 million, the wraparound services, and there was immediate uptake when we announced it at the last UBCM in September. My phone was literally ringing off the hook from local governments that really wanted to partner with a government like ours that was coming together and saying, we have a resource that we want to deliver in communities throughout the province. Make sure that there are some housing opportunities that come with services for people who are homeless, so that those on the front lines, local governments that are on the front lines who have been essentially managing this alone, can actually start to see things develop in their communities. And we've opened up our first one in Marpole a couple of weeks ago, and there's more coming online. 1,300 units have already been committed, and over a dozen communities, and there's certainly a long lineup of other communities that are hoping to also access this opportunity in their community.
So this afternoon, and if you're watching the show live on Thursday this afternoon, there was a press release came from the government saying there's a big announcement, you and the Premier in Vancouver tomorrow. Yeah. Now, you can tell us what it is. We won't tell anyone what's coming tomorrow.
Sure.
It is something to do with transit,
It's something to do with transit, and
people are going to be happy?
And people will be happy.
Okay, so tune in tomorrow. A lot of questions for you on tape, and let's start with Richard Zussman, my friend from Global TV. Here he is.
Minister Robinson, affordability is one of those words that gets floated around in the Vancouver housing market. What is affordable to you?
Very good question from Mr. Zussman. When we talk about affordability, it's important to recognize that we're talking about people. And people have all kinds of incomes, and they have all kinds of things that they need to pay for. So whether it's rent or mortgage, it's food, it's transportation, it's clothing, it's making sure that your kids have whatever it is they need for school supplies. And so when we talk about affordability, we want to make sure that there's enough money in people's pockets so that they can do the things that they need to do to take care of their families and that they can participate in the economy. And so CMHC, the federal government, has a sort of a third of your income makes life affordable. And so that's the key that we look at. We believe.
So that'd be like a third going to rent, or a third going to your mortgage,
right,
or a third going to basically putting a roof over
your roof overhead, and that leaves you enough money in your pocket to get food, to participate in community so that you're not isolated, to make sure that your kids have shoes, to do the things that you need to do so that you can have a nice life. And that's what we mean when we talk about affordability.
You got a target?
A target on affordability? Or
yeah.
that British Columbians can all afford to live comfortably in some fashion. Not everyone is going to be able to live in a mansion, and not everyone needs to live in a tiny little something, that we all have different capabilities. But at the end of the day, we all want British Columbians to be able to afford a roof over their head that meets their needs, this couple that I mentioned earlier, that with the one child in a one-bedroom basement suite, it wasn't meeting their needs. They needed a two-bedroom home of some kind, whether it was an apartment or a larger basement suite. It just wasn't available. It's just not available to them, and so it's not meeting their needs, and therefore it's inappropriate housing for them, and it's creating stress.
Andrew McLeod from the Tyee. So sometimes with government programs you get targets, and sometimes you get measurements. Sometimes with new programs you don't. Here's Andrew.
The budget included a lot of measures to soften the demand in the housing market. Carol James used the word moderation. We want to moderate the prices. I'm wondering what exactly that means in your mind. How will we know whether the measures have been successful?
Do you think you might actually drive down prices?
I think what we want to do is, if the prices have been going on this steep incline, we want to sort of temper that down. The incline has been very, very hard for people, and it's been really hard on businesses. The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade a number of years ago put out a really good paper that talked about the impact it's having on the business community. People can't hire, they can't expand their businesses, and so we recognize that we need to address that. But it's more than that. We also need to recognize that we have a supply problem as well. It's not a one thing, and that's why we have a 30-point plan that covers a range of components to address this housing crisis. And the supply component wants to make sure that we're making sure that there's the kind of housing that we need in communities right across the province. Because what we need in the Lower Mainland is not what's needed, for example, in Tofino. I met with the Tofino Chamber of Commerce beginning of the year with the mayor and council in a joint meeting, and they were saying to me as Minister of Housing that they're struggling with housing for their workers. They don't have worker housing, and that means that their businesses can't grow and meet the demand, certainly in the summer when Tofino is busiest. And so they have some very unique challenges in trying to figure out how can they get the kind of worker housing they need so that they can be successful.
I've heard this complaint, the point you make about getting the right kind of housing. I've heard this complaint that particularly in Vancouver you get an enormous number of entry-level condos and high-end stuff can look after itself. But there's kind of a mid-range, maybe the 2- and 3-bedroom townhouse, the the place for somebody with a young family. They're not everybody who wants a completely detached home.
Yeah.
They don't expect that, but that there isn't, that middle range is not being taken care of. Is that a fair comment, and are there things government can do about it?
Absolutely, it's a fair comment. And the other part is we're not getting people downsizing out of their big homes because there's no place for them to downsize to because they can't live in 600 square feet. So, and we certainly saw that in Coquitlam. It's not unique to Vancouver. I saw that when I was on council. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to the kind of stock we have, and that's one of the things that's in our 30-point plan. Is we are asking local governments to do a housing needs assessment every 5 years, and with the idea that there's opportunities for us to always keep an eye on what kind of housing we currently have, what our growth is in terms of our official community plan, what our expected housing needs are going to be. You can take a look at Stats Canada to take a look at what your population looks like in terms of ages. You can make some really good educated guesses around what kind of family housing you're going to need, seniors housing you're going to need. And then you can, when you make land use decisions, that helps to inform local councils about working with the development community and others to make sure that it's the right kind of stock when they need it.
Bill Tillman with one of the challenges that's certainly out there in Metro Vancouver. Here's Bill.
Minister Robinson, one of the biggest challenges you have and city officials have and the federal government has is that residents on single-family lots don't want density. They don't want to have row housing or apartments or townhouses or laneway houses or carriage houses nearby them. They like to have the idea of the white picket fence and a big yard. How do you get around that? Because I see no other way we can solve the problem of affordability in Metro Vancouver without increasing density fairly dramatically.
Another good question. We are starting to see a shift, and I'm going to give you an example that just happened this week. And this took place in Port Moody. It was about increasing density, including some significant affordable homes right by the Evergreen line. And there's a real tension in this community around no more density, we've had enough, and younger voices, I'll say younger because they were younger, and they're starting to organize for sort of the YIMBY voices, they're called. They're YIMBY, yes in my backyard.
Oh, neat. I've never heard that term before.
And I saw it floating around on Facebook because Port Moody's right near Coquitlam, of course, and so and I was watching sort of the tension on Facebook around this pushback. So the next generation has a role to play. Those people who are looking for housing, and I want to encourage them to get out to their local governments, to get out to the public hearings, and make their needs known well to councils that they need this density so that there's affordability for them. They don't want to be living in their parents' basements. It's not what they had envisioned, and it's not what parents had envisioned. And they want the opportunity to have a home, their own roof over their head, that meets their needs. And as they grow their families, they could move to housing that meets their needs. And density, Mr. Tillman is accurate. Density in certain parts of the province will help to alleviate that, and hearing those voices is really important. So what happened in Port Moody was the council voted 5-2 in favor of this increased density, and I do believe that those voices being at council, I think, made a difference. It helped council to understand the community better. When you only have one voice and the voice is only opposition, it's much harder to change things up, but when you hear the other voices, it creates a bit more balance.
We had the report this week on the BC election, and there was some growth in terms of voting by younger voters, which is one of the things that we watch for. The last federal election, there was a jump as well, and I tell you, the fastest way to get a politician's attention is the thought that you might show up and vote against them in the next election. So that's interesting, a YIMBY movement. I think you're onto something. I think it's got some potential with local councils, because just showing up at a meeting can have a big influence. You sat on council, right?
I sat on council.
Yes,
and
those hearings can go on for a long time.
And it is hard. It is hard when you have 300 people and people are upset or worried or afraid, and one after the other, and it goes until 2 or 3 in the morning, and sometimes they do that, or it goes over 2 nights. And you want to be responsive, and you want to be open, and making sure that your voice is heard is really very critical, and it does mean something, and it does carry weight. So the question, sometimes becomes, how do we help those people who have a vested interest in seeing things change? How do we encourage them to get involved and understand that participating in the democratic process has meaning and will make things different for them, and their voices will be heard?
Richard Zussman again, and another good question. Here's Richard.
Minister Robinson, one of the big issues with building new housing is actually getting municipalities to approve the permits. How do you require municipalities to get those permits approved more quickly?
So the previous government used to talk about 100,000 units of housing in the pipeline in Metro Vancouver, and they also talked briefly about either offering local council some kind of incentive or some kind of a push that they would have to turn thumbs up, thumbs down on a development within a time frame, months or years. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I think it's an interesting perspective, because when we talk about getting the supply and getting the right supply, we also need to make sure that we're working together with local governments to help them also do that. And so some of that is some of the YIMBY stuff that we just talked about to help move things along. Part of what happens is if there's opposition early on before it even gets to public hearing, they often send it back to the developer to say, no, you need to get people on side because it's not going to go through. So there's really, and it's really important to hear from people early on. And the other part of it is to make sure that we have a robust system that takes care of all the elements that we need to do, and in terms of the land use planning, and working with local governments to identify the best practices, because there are some local governments that do move better, easier, more quickly, and working with local governments to help them do that as well.
Yeah, I've seen, I think one of the developer agencies has puts out a kind of a rating sheet on how long it takes, and it's out there, and you can go and see how your local council is doing. And the minister is right there. She's probably too polite to name the worst offenders on the list, but man, is there a big difference. And I know that's true in the capital region here as well. Some councils are a lot faster than others at getting stuff through it. Maybe it's just because the staffing is better, or is there a shortage of staff that you can help out with?
It's very interesting that you say that. I know a local council. I'm going back about 18 months. They also have a lot of projects coming through, and certainly there's ebb and flow in these sorts of things, and so it's always challenging to identify at what point you need to staff up. But they knew they needed to staff up in their planning department because things were coming in fast and furious. Finding the right people is very, very difficult given how much development there is going on, particularly in the Lower Mainland, South Island. So what they did was they offered somebody from Edmonton a job. And he took a look at the housing market and said, I can't afford to live there.
Wow.
So you can see how we're in this pickle where we have a housing crisis. One of the pieces that we really need to do is make sure we're getting the right supply in the right communities, and we need to be working together to do that. But you need staff to help move these projects along, but if you can't get staff to do it. So this is what happens when you ignore this situation for too long.
We had a BC finance minister some years ago went to a national conference of finance ministers where the national government was talking about changing the financing formula for provinces because British Columbia was so rich in its housing. And he told his colleagues at the table, I can't afford a house in my riding. So don't tell me that it's, and that was years ago. I would think now that would be even more true for some parts of Vancouver, for anybody who was finance minister. Take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us with the Minister of Everything, and we'll be right back.
Along with low-income tenants having a difficult time affording rental housing, another big issue that we see with the folks particularly that I work with is that they're having a hard time maintaining appropriate housing, a housing that is safe, secure, and is appropriate for their lifestyle. And we find that there's a lot of stresses on tenants because they're finding that they're forced to remain in rental housing that's not appropriate for them because there's no options in terms of where to go.
Oh, hi, Janai Aragon here. Make sure you watch Voice of BC on Shaw TV.
Help me run.
Help me go places.
Help me swim. How we give hugs.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Housing is one of the largest parts of our ecological footprints, and so I believe that the raising of building codes and standards so that, for example, you can't source wood from endangered forests like old growth forests, or that the energy efficiency of new buildings has to be upgraded substantially, that this would be a major step forward and it would be a good policy to implement in this province.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. And Minister, you're going to love this question. You can talk yourself into so much trouble on this issue in such a short time as a cabinet minister. Let's go to Bruce Halser. Here he is.
Minister, one of your first acts in government was to get rid of tolls, which was an election promise on certain bridges. You also cancelled the proposed bridge to replace the Massey Tunnel. Now there's a commission on road pricing, a municipal commission, which is asking for a bigger investment in transit infrastructure, but also looking at different models for how we might pay for that, particularly road pricing. Do you support road pricing in theory? And if asked, will your government support and bring in legislation to implement road pricing if it's requested by the mayors?
How does the reporting back on that commission happen?
Well, it's the mayors who put together that commission, but they're really what we're really talking about here is congestion, right?
Yes.
And it's a significant problem. I know that there's a significant problem here in South Island a little bit. It's very significant.
Not compared to Vancouver.
It's very significant in Vancouver. And we want people to have the ability to move freely through the region. We want goods to be able to move freely through the region. And we want to have a robust transit system that gets people out of their cars to reduce GHG, but also to get people home faster, home to their families, home to play with their kids, home to do the things that they want to be doing rather than sitting in their car. And idling and listening to the radio or doing whatever it is they're doing. But really, at the end of the day, people just want to get home. And so the mayors have taken it upon themselves to take a look at what are some of the options. And I look forward later this spring, they'll have the report, and I look forward to seeing what they have to say.
Is this something they're likely to take action on in a civic election year?
I have no idea. I have no idea. It really is up to the mayors. I know that they're trying to make sense of this, and I look forward to hearing sort of what are some of the options that come out of the report.
They would have options that they could just do themselves, and there'd be options they could ask the province, right?
Yeah. So, and I don't want to presuppose what they're going to do. I do know that what people in the Lower Mainland have said is this congestion is getting worse. Remember, there's 1 million people that were expected to come into the Lower Mainland. I think it's by 2050. And so when I think about what that means, when I think about what it means for British Columbia in terms of goods getting stuck, our ability to move around the system, we need to sort of be prepared for what that looks like, and the mayors have taken this on.
Rob Shaw with a question on one of the alternatives. Here's Rob.
Minister, how do the business plans look for the Surrey LRT and Broadway subway line? We've been wanting to see them for a long time. Do they make sense? Are they good use of public dollars? And what about the idea of SkyTrain instead of above ground rail in Surrey? Is that something you're willing to consider?
So the business case is being looked at right now, and we're waiting to see sort of how things play out.
For both of them?
Well, for the Broadway,
line
the
and
Broadway
the
line, yes, those business cases for both of those, yeah.
And the light rail, the one that, the light rail in Surrey, and I've looked at it a couple of times. I understand the reason why Surrey wants the line, but I've also been looking at the experiment in Edmonton with light rail, and it looks to me like it's causing a lot of problems at the street level that you don't see with an elevated system, traffic and loss of lanes. Are you sure that light rail is the way to go in Surrey?
Well, I think they're different things, and it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. So we have in my community in Coquitlam, I'll use that as an example because it's the most recent line that's opened up.
And it was originally talked about as light rail.
It was originally
it got switched to SkyTrain,
Yes.
and I think it was the right decision.
For the community, in terms of how the community developed. But I will tell you that the light rail decision created a road, Guildford Road, which is a super wide road because it was built for preparing for light rail. So we have this boulevard that we really don't need. So it's just a little piece of trivia.
Plant flowers.
They did. They planted flowers and trees. But as a result of the investment in this transit, we have lots of towers, very high density around the transit stations. And it creates a certain kind of feel, a certain kind of vibe, and a certain kind of community. Not all communities need that density in all the places that you would need this. And so a light rail provides a different kind of opportunity to create different kind of housing and a different kind of lifestyle and a different kind of living. So it's a bit of apples and oranges here.
But I have heard the Premier say that if the provincial government is going to, and I've heard the Prime Minister say this too, if senior governments are going to contribute to the construction of something as expensive as SkyTrain, there has to be some density coming with it.
Absolutely.
You can't have single family
Absolutely.
around the stations anyway.
Yeah, and that's absolutely critical. And that's again why we have my file, Municipal Affairs, Housing, and TransLink. That all these people all these pieces are interoperable, recognizing that we have some goals that we need to achieve as a government, but also as three different levels of government, and working together in order to deliver on this is what we're focused on. Making sure that we have the partnerships that we need in order to make life more affordable for British Columbians is always the foremost of our minds.
So from what I hear you saying, you're more interested at this stage in offering local governments incentives than putting in deadlines and demanding stuff from them?
My life experience is that you get a lot more working with people than working against people, and we certainly saw the challenges that existed between the old government.
There were some stimulating moments in that area.
And certainly the mayors, and how awful that was. It was awful to witness. People became more entrenched in their positions, and nothing happened. And who suffered? British Columbians suffered. British Columbians didn't get the things that they needed because we had governments fighting with each other, and that doesn't get us where we want to go.
Jeremy Lawson from UVic, speaking as a member of a special interest group on housing. Here he is.
I've got an insider's sort of question for you because I teach at a university, and it's always struck me that student renters are a funny lot. They don't stay long, they move around a lot, and some of them are still learning how to do household care. So it's a hard group to work into the wider housing picture. Is it part of a good strategy to deal with the housing problem that students face to refocus on universities and colleges building on their own campuses a little more and take some of the pressure off the rest of the housing market?
Good question. I lived in housing at University of BC many decades ago, centuries ago, but it was actually a pretty decent way, and UBC is a little isolated, so it's nice to be on campus as well.
Not so much anymore.
No
Not
way.
so isolated anymore.
That's true, yeah.
But that's an excellent question, and it's exactly what we're doing. And certainly in our budget, you saw that 5,000 units of student housing is what we've committed to, with an additional 3,000 in partnership. So, and when you think about the housing challenges that we have, and I've got a story for you about Castlegar, because you wouldn't expect that Castlegar would have a housing problem, but they do. They have a zero vacancy rate. because there's no student housing. And they have students that come in every September. There's 500 of them, and they take up all of the available rental housing. And so they have a 0 vacancy rate in Castlegar as a result. And so building student housing, if you think about it, if we could build the 500 units that they needed over there, then it frees up all of that other rental. And so it's a key component to our government's plan. Again, it's a 30-point plan, and student housing plays a very key component in freeing up some housing.
Christina Winter from the Green Party. Question that Andrew Weaver's raised in the legislature a couple of times. It's not strictly your file, as Carol James has answered most of the questions on it, but we'll ask it anyway. Here's Christina.
In the past, local governments have felt ignored by the BC Liberal government, but it seems like there's still a ways to go on bringing local government concerns and nuances on how provincial issues are impacting their communities into government decision-making. For instance, it seems like the government didn't consult with the Mayor of Kelowna on the new speculation tax, which has caused quite a bit of consternation in the area. Minister Robinson, what are you doing to improve local government relations?
So West Kelowna is now asked to be exempted from this tax, right?
Right. I work very closely with local governments. At the UBCM, I had 62 meetings in 4 days with local governments and spent a considerable amount of time reaching out to all of them. And I do think it is relationship-based. I think that she asked a very key question around what are you doing to improve relations with local governments and making sure that we are reaching out to them. I know that Minister Farnworth on his file around the marijuana file, the cannabis file, it was really critical that they consult with local governments. They're on the front lines when it comes to cannabis distribution and making some of the decisions. And he's done an excellent job reaching out to the UBCM as the body that works with local government, but also hearing from them at the UBCM, making sure that their voices are heard around some of the decisions. And the feedback that I have had is that they have been very, very pleased at the UBCM and local governments broadly about the ability for them to engage with him and make sure that their needs are heard.
I've heard a lot of questions, though, about the speculation tax and along the lines of why is my community in and why is some other community not in? And the example everyone's heard of is Whistler, where there is a serious problem with rental, but Whistler isn't included in the speculation tax. Sunshine Coast isn't, and yet I hear from strange, lovely, isolated little islands on the coast of British Columbia that are suddenly find themselves with a speculation tax. Do you know why some places are in and some places aren't?
Well, the focus has been urban centers. That's where we're seeing the biggest challenges around housing. It's also where we're seeing also some of the biggest challenges around the supply component as well. And I know that the minister is listening to the feedback and working on the implementation components this spring with the legislation coming in the fall.
I've never been to Mudge Island, but I think it's less urban than Whistler. That's all I'll say on that one. However, the minister did say today she's consulting, so we'll see. Let's go to Jordan Bateman. Good question.
Minister, your government is raising the property transfer tax on properties worth more than $3 million from 3% to 5%. This, of course, seems like a very popular populist measure, especially when you talk about multi-million-dollar properties on Vancouver's west side. The problem is, it also applies to land assemblies in places like Surrey and Langley and Coquitlam and Abbotsford, fast-growing communities where you have to piece together several properties in order to get enough acreage to build townhouses or condos or other housing. So this tax will actually make that housing more expensive. How are you addressing this? And aren't you worried that this new property transfer tax will actually erode affordability, not help it?
Well, we're making sure that we're addressing some of the gains that people have made. I mean, certainly we've heard where people have very, very, very expensive properties and they've accumulated wealth and there's no mechanism to pay their fair share, and balancing all of that out and making sure that we're investing in the places that we need to be investing in and making sure that we're having a balanced perspective here.
Should there be some kind of an exemption for like a development, that the kind of development that the province wants? So say someone's building a bunch of this mid-range housing, so they don't have to pay the PTT to put together all the land to do it?
Well, it's about finding the right balance and making sure that we are capturing that sort of that wealth that is being raised by all of this land speculation and what's increasing there, but also making sure that we're getting the right supply in the right communities is what we're really focused on.
So there was 114,000 units in the target over 10 years, but not all of that is built by government, right? Is there a percentage that's like private that has to happen?
Well, what we've done is we've taken a look at some of the very specific needs that families need. So I think about, for example, women fleeing violence. Nothing has been built in this community I think it's 20 years for women and children who need a safe place to go. And so we're going to be investing in that, making sure that there's opportunities throughout the province for women and children fleeing violence, making sure that we have housing for seniors, making sure that we have opportunities to build for First Nations that have particular difficulties with housing. And so these sorts of groups will have, government has made a commitment to build about 37,000 of those units. The remainder of that, the 70 some odd thousand units, are going to be in partnership. And what we've done, and we've recognized this, when we talk to the development community and we talk to the renter sort of community, the renter advocates, and we talk to planners and we talk to land economists, and we spent the fall talking to various groups. And then we brought them together in a conference in December, a day-and-a-half long conference, because these groups hadn't been talking to each other. Right, the nonprofit housing sector, tends to talk together, but they haven't been talking necessarily to land economists and the private sector, and the local governments and First Nations. And so we brought together all the potential partners into one room and had them talk with each other. And I have never in my life expected to hear a buzz like that, and recognizing the opportunities for these various sectors to come together. Recognizing that each has either capital or land or an asset or an opportunity to bring whatever they have to the table in order to build the kind of housing that we need. And I just had a meeting today with somebody who was at that conference. He's been in the development business for 30 years. And he told me he'd never in his 30 years seen anything like it. And he's so excited to see the opportunity to take a look at how do you put together a land trust, right? There are some groups that have various pieces of land throughout the province, but hadn't thought about putting it together as a land trust and leveraging their assets in order to build the kind of housing that's needed in one part of the province. So all of these ideas have been percolating, and we're bringing them all together with the Housing Hub, which is a new branch of BC Housing. It's a branch dedicated to bringing these various partners together. And if I could segue into talking about
Go ahead.
Yenta the Matchmaker and Fiddler on the Roof. Do you remember her?
Yes.
Yenta the Matchmaker. And her job was making what we call...
She's going to sing.
No, not going to sing. But her job was to make the match, right? The families come together. And in Yiddish, it's called a shidduch. Okay. And so she made the shidduch happen. And the way she did it was by understanding what the families represented, what their values were, what they wanted to get out, and her job was to make a match that lasted a lifetime. And the Housing Hub is like the Yenta the Matchmaker. Their job is to bring together the various partners and so that they're successful and that they have what they need in order to build the housing that British Columbians need.
Whereas if you were a rich man, you wouldn't have a problem in this province with housing.
Yeah, we can all break into song now.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, good. Great musical, though. I will give you that. Let's go to Jock Finlayson. We'll see if we can get a song out of this one. Here's Jock.
Minister, your government has signaled a desire to work with the development industry to help build 114,000 new affordable housing units in BC over the next decade. Business generally needs a stable tax and regulatory climate before they will commit large-scale investment capital. Isn't there a risk that the tax and regulatory changes affecting housing announced in the government's recent budget could discourage the development industry from actually partnering with your government?
Go ahead, Minister.
Not at all. I had this fellow in my office today looking really forward to being able to capitalize on some of the land that he and his organization have, and looking forward to working in partnership with us. They recognize that there's real opportunity to develop significant housing, and we also still haven't heard from the federal government yet either in terms of the national housing strategy.
I was going to ask you about that.
And we're in regular contact with the federal minister, and I'm looking forward to getting that piece of work done. That's ongoing. It's looking very favorable for us, so there'll be some more opportunity for us to leverage some of the federal dollars to help us deliver on our housing commitments.
We will take a brief break on Voice of BC with the Minister. Back with one more segment. Stay with us. Lots of questions to come.
One of the, I think, worst terms in the housing debate in British Columbia is the use of the word homeless, because it can mean so many things to so many different people. I think it's incumbent on the government to provide some real definition behind the various groups that make up that homeless population, so that various policies can be developed that best meet each group's needs, rather than throwing them all into one big category called homeless.
Hi, I'm Alex Hemingway, Public Finance Policy Analyst at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. If it's Thursday night, you should be watching Voice of BC. I do.
Where there are no bars, there's freedom. It's where we find the strongest connections. And power we never knew we had. It's not always easy. And sometimes you wonder what you got yourself into. But when the stars are your compass, you tend to find your way.
Most of the attention on Selina Robinson comes to the housing portfolio, but on municipal affairs, there's some serious problems. The BC NDP government changed the political financing to remove union and corporate donations, which I agree with, but it did not give any tax credits. So there's absolutely no incentive for people to give money, and businesses and unions can't give money. It's put municipal parties and municipal candidates in a tough position going into the October election, and I don't think there's time enough to fix it.
Well, welcome back, and I'll ask you, Minister, if you've heard that concern that Bill Thielman expressed, and does he have a point?
I actually don't think he has a point. I mean, what we're committed to doing is creating a level playing field. So everybody is running against everybody else who's in the same position of fundraising. And so there's no advantage now. It used to be that you could, if you were familiar with how things played out, if you knew who the unions were involved in supporting local candidates or developers or businesses supporting local candidates, then you could actually get significant opportunities. And now it's a level playing field for everybody. Everybody has to play by the same rules, and you don't get these, winners and losers just based on a fundraising capacity. Everyone is playing by the same rules now, and everyone has the same access to the same resources.
Yes, although some local government people pointed out to me that the provincial parties provided themselves with a subsidy for the next few years from taxpayers, but they did not provide equivalent money for local government.
If local governments want to provide subsidies to their candidates, they can do that too.
See, that's a good answer. Yeah. Didn't think of saying that to them. Let's go to Yuka Kurakawa. A good question about rentals. We've got a few questions coming up on rentals. Here she is.
Many renters across the province are having a difficult time finding affordable housing because rents are increasing much faster than incomes. As a way to address this, some jurisdictions, including Quebec, are tying rent increase laws to individual rental units as opposed to individual tenants. Is this something that the minister will be implementing?
Is this even doable?
Well, we took immediate steps early on. We made sure that we had more resources for the residential tenancy branch. It had been severely underfunded, and we're making some good progress there. We also took care of the fixed term lease loophole, and that was where people would lose their security after a year, instead of having their tenancy rolled into month to month, where they could be sort of threatened to have to sign a new lease with a significant increase and bypass the rent control. And that was never intended to be that way. So we took care of that as well. That was really important. We also got rid of the geographic rent increase, and that was an opportunity for landlords if they're built similar buildings in their neighborhood were getting significantly more rents, that you could apply to the residential tenancy branch and have your rents bumped up too. And that was my understanding when I dug into it about why that was. It was if your family had a rental building and it was your grandmother's, and over the years she never really changed the rent, and then you inherited it and you see it needs all this repair work, you could find a way to bring it up to standard. But what was happening in terms of how it was being used by some bad landlords was they were going to their tenants, and it's happened a number of times in the West End and in North Van, where they were going in and putting notices under people's doors and saying, we're increasing your rent by 20%. And if you don't pay, we're going to go to the residential tenancy branch because we know we can increase it to 40%. And none of that was accurate, but people felt coerced. And so we put an end to that because they were taking advantage of people's fear and taking advantage of a low vacancy rate, so people were stuck. And so we ended that opportunity. There's certainly more to do. We've announced that we're going to be looking at, with legislation, that what's known as demoviction or renoviction, the eviction due to demolition and renovation, and providing a bit more security for renters.
But there are old buildings that need renovating.
Absolutely. And again, we have some bad owners who take advantage of that. And so they're not actually doing the renovation that requires you to leave. So, just paint and carpet does not require people leaving. Changing a toilet does not require people having to leave. And so there have certainly been instances where we know that renters are forced out because of this renovation that's happening that doesn't require.
So the branch would be able to decide whether or not it was a legitimate renovation or not.
And there's a compliance unit now that didn't used to exist, so there's actually some teeth now for the residential tenancy branch. And we're also, and in cases where there legitimately does need to be a major renovation that requires, like the windows are going to be changed and all the electrical and plumbing, it's going to be something significant. We want to make sure that people have enough of a buffer, enough time to make appropriate changes, and enough financial resource to find other accommodation.
Doesn't sound like you're thinking of this thing, though, of tying the rent essentially control to the unit, not to the tenant.
No, we chose not to do that.
Yeah. Let's go to Tom Fletcher, Black Press. Here he is.
Minister, your 30-point housing plan includes $378 million over 3 years to help people like nurses and carpenters pay the rent. I'm starting to wonder how many people will not be getting a rent subsidy by the time this program comes out. These people are middle-class earners. If the government is going to subsidize the rent of everybody who's poor and who's middle class, who's going to pay for all that?
That was interesting. That's not what it says in the 30-point plan. We wanted to take some immediate steps to make sure that those who are really struggling with rent and those people who really don't have much revenue. So I'm thinking about, and I think he's referring to RAP and SAFER, the Rental Assistance Program and SAFER. And what we found, and I'll give you an example of what we've been hearing from seniors in particular, families too, but I've got a lot of senior examples because I was a seniors critic when I was in opposition. And the seniors advocate certainly spoke about this in her reports, where seniors are getting their supplement, a rent supplement. They're on a fixed income, and they have expenses, and they are choosing to not take their medication every day because they can't afford it every day, so they take it every other day so that they can pay rent. And those are, that no one wants that for seniors. And what's happening is the rents are going up faster than the rent supplement has been going up. So we wanted to make sure that there was a bit more money in their pockets so that they can pay for the medications that they need. They can socialize with their friends. They can actually have healthy foods. And we've done the same thing with the Renter Assistance Program for families. we're also, and I think what he's referring to is we've changed the threshold from $35,000 to $40,000. And I don't know any nurses who are making $40,000. But the idea is to make sure that there's opportunity for them to hang on to their housing. Because if they lose their housing, I think it's really important that we understand what's going to happen. If they lose their housing, they're going to leave, and we're not going to have people to take care of us in hospitals. We're not going to have people building our homes. We're not going to have people fighting our fires. Like we have to make sure that we're tackling this problem from many different angles. And so going to our most vulnerable is where we've taken some steps. But we also are focusing on the housing hub, which is going to build the bulk of that housing for those who are middle income families.
Okay. Bruce Halser, another question from the rental side, this time about incentives to build more rental housing. Here is Bruce.
Your government wants to create more rental housing, particularly at the lower end of the market. And yet we hear from landlords that they're afraid of investing in more rental housing because they're afraid that your government is going to introduce tighter rent controls. And they're also worried about amendments to the residential tenancy branch. They're concerned that residential tenancy arbitrators don't always have an even hand between landlords and tenants. And of course, when a landlord is found to be in breach of a contract, the tenants have an easy way to get a remedy. But when the tenant has breached the contract, caused damage, or skipped out on rent, it's almost impossible for landlords to ever recover that money. Are you concerned that your government doesn't have a reputation for having an even hand among landlords? And what could you do to give landlords more security so that there's more incentive for them to provide rental accommodation?
It's a good question. So first of all, I think it's really important to recognize I have an excellent relationship with Landlord BC. They stood with us when we addressed the fixed term lease loophole and the geographic rent increase. They were with us 100% of the way, and they're really supportive and recognize the importance of finding balance, and that's something that we're very committed to doing. The piece that I think is really important that he mentioned was this incentive for landlords, and I've reached out to the federal minister and have had a positive conversation about working with the federal government to incentivize landlords. If you remember the old MURBs back in the 70s, there was an opportunity to make sure that there were some real incentives to get some of this housing built. And our conversations to this point have been positive in terms of creating some more opportunities. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to work with the federal government and make sure that we have some real opportunities for people to build purpose-built rental.
If you're going to have the private builders build it, they're going to have to make a decent return on it.
Absolutely.
Well, let's go to Mr. Zussman. This is a very good question, and I feel for people caught up in this. Here's Richard.
Minister Robinson, I know animal welfare is something that's important to you. What do you do to ensure that there are regulations in place to allow people to have their pets in their rental homes?
There was some figure last year from the SPCA, something like 1,000 animals a year that they get turned in.
Yeah.
In Metro Vancouver because people can't keep them in their rental place.
It's such a difficult market for so many. Like I think about the people with children who can't find place, seniors who can't find place, people with disabilities. I mean, it's another group that really struggle. Like, 3-story walk-ups just aren't a possibility if you're in a wheelchair. Like, it's really, really a challenge. And at the end of the day, what we really need is supply. We need a healthy vacancy rate. We need to make sure that people aren't stuck in housing that doesn't meet their needs, that they can find a place. And what's really going to make a difference for all of those people who need housing is having more stock that is available, so that with a healthy vacancy rate we can do that. And certainly in our plan, there's a whole bunch of things that we're doing to free up and loosen up some of that. So the student housing, building the right kind of supply in the right communities, having the housing hub bring together various partners so that we can attack the middle income, missing middle housing, making sure that we're building different kinds of housing so that people who are in rental, for example, can actually maybe even move into purchase. And one of the things about the Housing Hub that I'm really excited about that they're tasked with is looking at various home ownership opportunities. So whether it's co-op housing, shared equity, that they're tasked to look at some creative ways to help people who want to move out of rental, want to start with home ownership, have the opportunity to do that as well.
The government House Leader Mike Farnworth has talked on this show about this thing that the province got dumped into its lap by Ottawa, which is marijuana legalization and all the legislation he has to do now. I assume you've got something in your area involving landlords, tenants, and marijuana in. Can landlords ban cannabis in their buildings? I mean, are you going to be dealing with this spring?
Well, it's going to be an interesting time for all of us, and certainly an interesting learning curve in terms of how do we adapt to these, this new legal product and the impact it's going to have, what it's going to have, and we also are not going to have edibles. My understanding is for some time.
Yes.
So. Edibles are less of an issue. It's the smoking that's going to be a challenge. It's a challenge for local governments. It's a challenge in strata. It's a challenge in rental. It's going to change the landscape. And again, my colleague Mike Farnworth has been doing, the yeoman's share of that work and making sure that he's consulting with the right people on it.
18 pieces of provincial legislation have to be changed. I'm going to ask if we could maybe skip ahead one clip because I really want to get to this question from Andrew McLeod of the Tyee. It's an important issue. Let's go to Andrew. Here he is.
What do you see as the main barriers to ending homelessness in British Columbia, and what is your government doing to overcome them?
Just big stories this week out of a big tent city in Nanaimo.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It is one of those things that has been growing and growing and growing under the previous government, and it's one of those things that we need to attack from many different sides. So, and our government is doing just that with our 30-point plan. We want to prevent homelessness, right? So it's one thing to deal with it when it's there, and I'll talk about sort of the modular housing in a moment, but I want to talk about preventing homelessness, and that's what our 37,000 units that we're bringing online is to do. So women fleeing violence, again, building First Nations housing, making sure that seniors have housing. We're starting to see more and more seniors in our homeless population, and that's because SAFER hasn't kept up, and so they lose their housing. So we've brought in an influx into this SAFER to make sure that they had a little bit more money so that they could pay rent. So really attacking it from all sides. Now the part about those who are homeless, we brought in September a commitment to 2,000 units of modular housing, and this modular housing.
Tell people what it is, because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Yeah, it's fascinating in terms of how it's built. It's a style of building. It's not. People often think of a trailer, and it's nothing like a trailer. Like, we need to ban that from your mind. It's not a trailer. They're built in factories, and the one that we're using up in Kamloops is quite fascinating in terms of how they do it. They were actually getting ready to close their doors as a business, and now they've doubled their workforce, so it's a local business. And they build it all sort of machines. It's all laser cut wood, less waste, but they can build it in just a matter of a couple of weeks, a unit. And hotels, they're building actually hotels using this technology. But you can put it up in a couple of months once the land is cleared and ready, in 2 months. And it's all built in an enclosed factory, so it's not exposed to the elements. So you have better controls. These rooms are, when I first saw it, I thought of a unit that my grandfather lived in, which is sort of a self-contained unit. It had a little sort of bed over to the side with a night table, and it had a little sitting area and a little table, a great bathroom, walk-in bathroom with a shower and a sink and a toilet, and then a little kitchenette. So a couple of burners and no oven, just a microwave and a fridge and a sink and a storage closet. And it's a self-contained sort of 300 and some odd to 400 square feet depending on whether it's an accessible unit or not. And it's a little sort of home, and you can lock the door. And they're put together modularly, kind of like Legos, and there's hallways, and you can't tell from the outside, and you can buy the modular for the staircase, so they're building them as 3-story walk-ups. And then there's like sort of the washer-dryer unit, and then there's a social place, often on the ground floor for meetings or bringing people together around food. And they go up very quickly, and that's the part that I was thrilled to see, is that we can actually do this very quickly. A traditional shelter, old-style building, 4 or 5 years.
The minister is pretty good on that subject alone, fairly enthusiastic, and I'm sort of sorry we ran out of time, but we have. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much. And I want to remind everyone, and it comes with wraparound support services, which is really key.
Oh. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into the living room. Good night. That was good. That was a nice way to end.